Hi, welcome to Kinesiology 5309, Management of Sport Delivery Systems and Organizations. You've arrived at Module 1. We're going to spend some time throughout this module defining the field of sport management and our view of organizations. Throughout the next 8 weeks, we will be examining those organizations or sport organizations from various points of view. I want us to begin thinking about how we might establish our perspective regarding sport managers and sport management, as well as those job descriptions. So first, in your perspective, what is a sport manager? And secondly, what duties fall under a sport manager's job description? When we keep these things in mind or have this perspective, it will help us going forward as we examine various sport organizations. More specifically, I understand that each of you have a different perspective. That is, those careers that you want to pursue, and therefore the duties that fall under those are different. I really think it'll be important to keep those things in mind as we venture forward and examine different areas of sport organizations. Let's start off with some key definitions. First, what is our definition of sport management? And according to our text and according to our author, management of those organizations whose major domain of operation is sport and physical activity. So then, secondly, what is a sport organization? It is a social entity involved in the sport industry. It's goal-directed with a consciously structured activity system and a relatively identifiable boundary. With that being said, I hope we recognize, and we'll keep this as we begin to establish our perspective, that sport management is broad and diverse in covering sport and physical activity, and those sport organizations are also rather broad and diverse. Now that we have our definitions of sport management and sport organizations, let's then give a definition of a sport manager as well as those views. So first of all, a sport manager is a person whose job entails planning, organizing, staffing, directing, and controlling within the context of an organization whose primary or predominant product or service is sport and sport related. I want to point out that throughout the next several modules, we will be examining those very things of planning, organizing, staffing, directing, and controlling. So what is a sport manager's view? Sport managers view the field as one that's concerned with various forms of physical activity participation. This goes back to our notion of sport organizations being broad and diverse. Sport managers view the field as something that can be professional and or semi-professional sport. It can be intercollegiate athletics or college sport. It can be recreational agencies such as Baseball USA. It could be fitness and sports clubs. Maybe it's a YMCA. It can be recreation administration. Maybe that is someone involved with the Houston Parks and Rec Department. Or it can be fitness management. Again, I recognize that when we begin to examine sport management and sport managers, the field is diverse, which is why oftentimes I'll ask you to think about your specific area of interest. Let's return back to this concept of sport organization or organizational economics. First of all, organizations are mechanisms that have evolved to facilitate the process of exchange of products. Furthermore, organizational arrangements are needed to support any particular exchange, and this will depend on the characteristics of the exchange. So I want to pose the question, what entities are involved in the exchange being facilitated by sport organizations? If we think back to our previous slide about the views of sport managers, remember we can be involved in things such as professional and semi-professional sport. So with that in mind, we'll think about the exchange that's being facilitated between professional and semi-professional sport. That exchange could be represented in fans attending a game. Secondly, there is this notion we talked about in the previous slide of intercollegiate athletics. Then, thinking back to then a sport organization revolving around intercollegiate athletics, what's the exchange being facilitated there? That one is an interesting balance because not only are student athletes performing, but they also have to perform in the classroom. Next is those recreational agencies. That exchange, again, looks different. These are individuals looking for an organization to help them facilitate recreational activities. Then we talked about fitness and sports clubs. Remember, again, this exchange looks different. It's less about competition and more about physical activity, maybe even fun. Then there's recreation administration. My example previously was the Houston Parks and Recreation Department. That exchange is again different. That is a governmental exchange with the community or the people in the city. And then finally, fitness management. These individuals are concerned with exchanging this idea of fitness and physical activity to their population. So with that in mind, again, finally, I want us to just make note and consider that these organizational arrangements are different depending on the characteristics of the exchange. We're going to move on now and talk about what that exchange could be, whether it's a good or a service. Let's think about sport organizations now as producers of goods or services. So what is a good? It's a physical object that's produced at one time and used later. Our example is sporting equipment, promotional materials, and merchandise. Nike produces goods. Under Armour produces goods. It's those physical objects. It's your golf clubs, it's your basketball shoes, it's your basketball. Those items are physical, they are produced and used later. On the contrary, what's a service? Services are perishable, intangible, they're oftentimes occurrences or processes that are experienced or performed for a customer. A service is typically all sport and recreational organizations, and these organizations classify as service organizations. So let's take an example of the Houston Astros. As soon as you walk up to attend a Houston Astros game, you encounter a number of services. Services are done by or given to fans by those individuals that are selling the tickets, those individuals that help the fan get to their seat. There's also things such as music. There's the entertainment provided by the mascot. All of these things are perishable and intangible and result in occurrence or a process, and they are what often we deem as experiences for a customer. So recall that then, a good is something that customer or consumer can have in their hands and take home. A service I would liken to a memory that a fan can experience. Please note though that a good can ultimately result in a consumer repurchasing a product, but also the experience of the consumer as involved in a service also results in the consumer or the fan returning to purchase the product. We're going to spend our next couple of slides giving some more specific information about services. First of all, I want us to consider these 5 attributes of a service. Intangibility is this notion that the customer or maybe even the fan can't judge the quality of the product before actually obtaining it. Those notions of intangibility also recognize that services offered are often psychological and or social benefits to the fan or customer. Second is this idea of perishability. Excuse me. The service can't be produced and stored for future use. It's not like a good. You can't purchase it and use it later. Heterogeneity gives us this notion that services are relatively more variable in quality. The services, say, for example, at a Houston Astros game may be very different than those services that are provided by, we'll say, the Anaheim Angels. Next is this idea of simultaneously consuming a good or service. What does that mean? Service has to be consumed as it's produced. That is, the service that is offered at the game for the Houston Astros, it has to be consumed simply as it's produced. And then lastly is this notion of transfer of ownership. What this concept is, in a good, the ownership is transferred from, say, Nike to now the consumer. With this notion of services, there is no transfer of ownership per se. So what are some categories of services? There are rented goods services, place and space rentals, labor and expertise rentals, physical facility access services, and network access and usage. We'll talk a little more in the future about these things. There are two thoughts behind this classification of sports services. First, there's production participation. This is the degree to which clients engage in the production of the service. You can think about this like the degree to which clients engage at a health club. There's also this notion of service experience. This is the extent to which the client's engagement in the service is hedonistic or agonistic. This is a recognition that asking clients to engage in sport services, some of those clients will engage for this pursuit of pleasure. There's also a recognition that asking clients to engage in these sport and physical activities can sometimes result in competitive, even combative, or painful experiences. I was thinking of the example of CrossFit, and this service experience presented to your clients at a CrossFit gym in some ways is painful, competitive, maybe even combative. That those clients can improve on their physical activity, but it is a recognition that clients' engagement in the service does involve this pursuit of pleasure or this acknowledgement that there is pain involved, especially surrounding physical activity. Let's consider now the three natures of services. First, there's consumer services. These are often those low-skilled and routine tasks. An example of this would be the reception desk at a health club. The individual working at the receptionist desk would be responsible for checking in clients into the health club. A more advanced service is professional services. These individuals have typical knowledge and expertise. This, for example, is the tennis pro at the health club who has knowledge and expertise as pertaining to tennis. Human services is a type of professional service, and it's devoted to transforming people in some way. Our next slide is going to delve into this a little more deeply. Let's delve deeper into this nature of human services. Recall from our previous slide that human services are a type of professional service. Therefore, they require knowledge and expertise. The purpose, though, or the devotion of a human service is to transform people in some way. Three ways that I want us to think about this notion of transforming people. People processing, people sustaining, and ultimately people changing. So what is this concept of people processing? This refers to a function to test or screen people in order to place them in a particular class on some specific criterion. This could be, for example, that we use a people processing method in youth sports leagues in order to assess the abilities of the different applicants before assigning them to specific teams. Lifeguards may even do this type of people processing by watching young people swim in order to determine whether they can swim in the deep end or should be in the shallow end. Next, our next function, I should say, of human services is this idea of people sustaining. This function is to sustain people or prevent or delay the decline in the welfare or status of our clients. This is a major function of social service. So some of our concepts or examples may be that a master's swimming program aims to help participants develop and maintain a certain level of fitness over time by sustaining that. Our last concept of human service is people changing. This concept is aimed at some changes in our clients in terms of one or more, whether it's physical, psychological, or social attribute. One of our big ones that we see in this industry or sport managers may encounter is this notion of people changing for health and fitness. Fitness programs are designed at getting people healthier. Physical activity programs are helping people be more relaxed and energized, as well as those youth programs are helping people change in their skill level. Human services are unique because they are devoted to humans. Let's think about and classify our sports services. There are participant services, those that participate in something. There are spectator services, those that watch. Sponsorship services, those that are connected to a product. Donor, those that give money. And there's also this notion of social ideas. Our next slide will see this from a graphical standpoint. There's a lot to cover in this slide, but I think it gives us a good visual representation of this classification of sport services. Let's first start with participant services. Participant services help clients engage in sport or physical activity. There's a couple of ways that we can consider or break down these participant services. First, there's consumer services, and those are pleasure or health and fitness services. Those consumer pleasure services refer to the scheduling or reserving of facilities or equipment as requested by clients who seek pleasure in physical activity. That next consumer service of health and fitness is that those services involve scheduling or reserving facilities or equipment to satisfy clients' desires to maintain health and fitness. Difference there, pleasure, and then ultimately the derived purpose of health or fitness. Next is this notion of human services. We've already talked about this a little bit, but let's take it some even deeper or further. Human skill is our first component. These are services that refer to the expert application of, say, teaching technology and leadership in developing skills. This human excellence services provide expert guidance and coaching for clients in their pursuit of excellence in a chosen physical activity. There's also human sustenance. These are services the organization uses to conduct exercise and fitness programs on a regular basis under the guidance. It's that idea of sustaining. And then human curative. These are services involving designing and offering physical activity to rehabilitate those. That idea of curing or improving. That's our notion under participant services. So let's talk about spectator services. This is the idea, or spectator services refer to the entertainment we provide to our client. 3 ways to think about this entertainment. First, it's the contest. It's the game or activity itself. This is often derived out of excellent participants, how a contest is unpredictable, or loyalty attached to, say, a team or a player. There's also this idea of spectator services of sport as spectacle. These are all of the things that go on in addition to the contest. It's those product extensions. It's cheerleaders. It's the marching band. It's the different types of ceremonies, say a halftime show or a pregame show. And then lastly, under our spectator services is this concept of third place. This offers opportunities for consumers or fans to have casual encounters with strangers in this quasi-primary kind. Okay, next, let's talk about sponsorship services. What does a sponsorship service do? This essentially allows sponsors the relationship to achieve its promotional objectives or to facilitate and support its broader marketing objectives. Furthermore, we can define sponsorship as this acquisition of rights to affiliate or directly associate with a product or event for a purpose of deriving these benefits. 2 things that this sponsorship service allows the sponsor. First, it gives that sponsor market access. So the major service offered to the sponsors is this access to communicate with the market, the direct, indirect market associated with the consumers of that sport. And then also, as we know, sponsorship allows us association. It helps with image building or image projection. Donor services. Donor services offer to propose an exchange in which a donor seeks psychic benefits. It can be those benefits of goodwill or good feelings. Okay, lastly, let's talk about social ideas. This concept is the promotion of social objectives such as fitness and health through physical activity. We've seen this through things such as potentially long ago, Nike's Just Do It campaign. We've also seen it more recently, this service to social ideas, through the notion of the NFL Play 60 or the NBA Cares. I understand there's a lot of information in this slide, but it gives us a way to cover all of these services in a visual representation. I think this is a helpful way to study also going forward. Now that we have already talked about our sport services, a This slide gives us a visual representation of how those sport services relate to each other. It takes into consideration how our participant services works in conjunction with donor services and social ideas, as well as where those participant services then connect to spectator services, as well as our sponsorship services. Again, I think this is a really great representation to give us some ideas of how these sport services connect. As we have begun to talk about concepts of sport services, hopefully we are recognizing that one of the major roles of sport management and sport managers is this notion of coordination. We will further talk about coordination in our next module, Module 2. However, I wanted to give us this visual to think about a sport manager is required to coordinate kind of these four areas: human resources, our technologies, our supporting units, as well as our context. Structure of an organization can be defined simply as the total of the ways in which it's divided into distinct tasks and then its coordination achieved among those tasks. We'll talk more about this going forward. Now that we've got our mind around some of the basic principles of the field of sport management and defining those fields based upon an organizational perspective, let's give ourselves a little bit of information on what is a classical view of organizations. So first, in defining that term, an organization is a tool people use to coordinate their actions to obtain something that they desire or value. It is to achieve their goals. And a very simplistic view of this is a group of people working together in some type of concerted or coordinated effort to attain objectives. This will be our classical view of organizations, and then we'll begin applying it to sport organizations. Now that I've given you the classical view of organizations, I want you to think about how you would define organization. And furthermore, in that opinion, are organizations always companies or are they nonprofits? Can groups of people be considered an organization as well? These are just some things I want us to think about as you begin to continue establishing your perspective around sport management and viewing sport organizations. In our classical view of organization, let's start off with the elements. So what are the elements of an organization? They have to be more than one person. It's often a result of specialized contributions or functions of each member in order that the organization can exist and operate. There's a coordination of those specialized functions, and as our definition indicates, there's a common end or goal. We'll be talking about these components or these elements as we move throughout the term. Let's discuss the attributes of organizations. First of all, there is an identity. If we think about specifically, we'll say our organization is Houston Baptist University. One of our founding principles or identity fit principles is this idea of a Christian worldview. That would be part of our identity. Second concept is instrumentality. This is the notion that the organization is more than just the sum of the parts. Next is the program of activity, that activity which the organization does or seeks to do. Membership. This is the notion that the organization controls who is a member of the organization. For example, if we go back to the idea of the organization of Houston Baptist University, one of the things you can think about is who can gain membership or what student could come to HBU. Obviously, that student would have to have a high school diploma, a certain a certain entrance exam score, and so on. Clear boundaries just indicate that what the organization does and does not do. Permanency. This is the idea that the organization is more permanent than individual members comprising it. So, for example, if a individual that is a member of an organization chooses to move on, that organization will still exist. Division of labor. This is where this notion of specialization comes into play, and we'll be talking about that going forward. Next, our hierarchy of authority. This is the coordinating of those specialized units. And then lastly, formal rules and procedures. These are the direct and control behaviors procedures. That is, these rules are put into place in order to direct and control particularly those division of labor. So, what are the ways for classifying our organizations? There are a number of those, particularly 5 here, that we've included. Is it a profit or nonprofit organization? With that, then, where is its source of funding? Does it come from public dollars, government dollars, stakeholders? Who benefits? That is, who's the prime beneficiary of this organization? It is the organization an employee-customer interface, or what type of interactions occur between the employee and the customer? And finally, is it a voluntary association, or are the participants or members of the organization volunteers? These are just ways that we can think about classifying our organization. Our previous slide gives us some basic criteria for classifying organizations. This slide gives us additional ways that we might classify organizations. For example, it goes into a bit more detail. Fotler's 1981 classification thinks about whether the organization is private for-profit, private non-profit, private quasi-public, or maybe even a public organization. Furthermore, we can break down that concept of who's our prime beneficiary. So, are there mutual benefit associations? Are there business concerns? Is it a service organization? Or are there commonwealth organizations? This brings us to the end of Module 1. We've done a number of things to think about how we might define the field of sport management, including giving definition to sport management, sport managers, and then better understanding sport organizations. Then we moved on to think about some classical views of organizations. Gave us our general overarching principles of how we might view organizations and ultimately how we're going to view organizations going forward. This slide offers us some questions for review. These questions are set up and designed to check your understanding of our modules. If you're able to answer these questions, then you've got a pretty good grasp of the material we've covered.